global arms trade is a big business. In recent years, global military expenditure is at its highest level since the Cold War, as recent data shows global spending at over $1.7 trillion annually. Each year, around 45 to 60 billion worth of arms sales are agreed, the bulk of which involve developing nations playing military catch-up. In fact, some governments spend more on military expenditure than on health, social development, and communications infrastructure combined. Since the early 1990s, there has been efforts to review and develop arms transfer principles and codes of conduct to ensure that arms are not sold to human rights violators. However, what little ground has been gained is rife with loopholes and lack of transparency, inviting corruption. Closer to home, while the American executive branch is calling on nearly all NATO members to ramp up military spending, more and more people are beginning to question the motivations of the global arms trade, its legality, and the future that is being molded. Hey, Calgary, I'm Kevin Chorney. Thanks a lot for joining us. Tonight, we're joined by Pablo Policzer, as well as David J. Bercuson. Gentlemen, thanks a bunch for taking the time. I know you've been busy. I think last week you had a speaking engagement alongside the good people, our friends at the Marda Loop Justice Film Festival. So, again, thanks for taking the time. Pablo, maybe I'll start with you. Tell me a little bit about yourself and your role at the UFC.
I'm a political scientist, and I'm the director of the Latin American Research Center. I'm also a fellow at the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, and I'm interested in security issues broadly understood. I've done some work on the nature of authoritarian regimes in South America. And I've also done some work on understanding how human rights organizations can hold rebel groups, non-state armed groups, to better account.
Wow, very well rounded. Thanks. This will be interesting. Looking forward to speaking with you. David, yourself, a little bit about your background.
I'm a historian of primarily the Canadian military, but also Canadian defense policy and Canadian foreign policy. Primarily since 1914, in that period, and also the director of the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary.
Also an author as well. You've both been very busy guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, it's great, it's great. Well, maybe I'll start with you then, David. The world is constantly at war, in one region or another. And yet from 2000 until 2010, global arms expenditures rose 53%. Why is that? What's so unique about that time?
I think there are a number of factors behind the growth of the dollar value of global arms sales. So the simplest one is that the rate of inflation in the defense industry is way higher than the rate of inflation in society at large or in the economy at large. For example, right here in Canada today, I think the rate of inflation is about 2.5–3%. But if you're buying weaponry, jets, ships, tanks, and so on, the rate of inflation is usually 2 to 3 times that of what the normal rate of inflation is. And there are a number of reasons for that, which we can go into if we've got the time. But what it means is that essentially the trend up on the price of weapons has been significant since over the last 17 years or so. Mm-hmm. Second thing is that I would like to say, in a sense, that the world began to return to normal, and I'll put normal in quotes, at about the time of 9/11, and that is that not just this supposed war against terror, it's not a phrase that I use, but not just the rise of Islamic groups in a variety of places in the world and attacks on the West and so on, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also what has been developing in Central Europe, the reemergence of Russian power and authority, the rapid growth of the Chinese and Indian navies in the South China and East China Sea. So a lot more people buying weapons, and then, as you put in introduction, third world countries doing their best, not so much to catch up, but to the third world countries, primarily dictatorships, doing their best to solidify and make more safe the dictators that are running their countries. And one of the ways they do it is buy more arms and solidify the hold that they have over their populations.
So, Pablo, it's estimated that global military expenditures hit around the $1.7 trillion mark, as I alluded to in my introduction. This industry employs hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Is weapons manufacturing and the trade that's involved, is it just an industry that's too big to fail?
I would put it a somewhat different way.
Okay.
I would say that it's unquestionably true that the industry has grown tremendously, and that it takes up a huge portion of many countries' budgets, certainly in the United States, outspends what I think the next 6 or 8 other countries do on defense combined. And the film that we discussed, that you mentioned, that we were at the Marta Loop Justice
the
Film Festival.
Shadow World.
Shadow World, that's right, that we discussed last week, was a really interesting account of this, sort of showing how this new military-industrial complex is really driven by greed, certainly. A lot of arms manufacturers there's a lot of corruption, and they sort of strike all sorts of shady deals with states.
Fascinating film, I'm told.
Yeah, it was a great film. It was a great film. And I guess what I want to do is inject a note of caution in kind of over-interpreting that kind of analysis, and that there's a lot of, if you just look at the headlines.
It's a big number, $1.7 trillion.
That's right.
Sure.
And so but also if you look at the headlines, you would be led to believe, headlines in the media, for example, that the world is becoming more violent. And if we all think that the world is becoming more violent, then there's a built-in kind of dynamic and a fear that therefore we have to buy a lot more weapons. Okay? But it turns out that if you look at the evidence of just about any measure of violence, sort of homicides, the trend has gone down. The number of interstate wars has gone dramatically down. The number of dictatorships and how they commit abuses against their populations, the rate of genocide, and all these indicators have gone down. So the real story is that violence is not that violence is breaking out all over the place, that the world has become more violent, but rather that peace is breaking out. Now, it doesn't mean that peace is breaking out everywhere. Certainly, there's many regions of the world that are mired in very brutal war right now. But I think it's important to keep that perspective, because it seems to me that part of the reason of why the arms industry has grown so much has exactly to do with the sense of fear that we all have by looking in many ways at the wrong data.
It begs the question, though. I mean, why is media so eager to be a proponent of reporting on violence? I mean, what's the end game here?
Well, isn't a standard line in
sex and violence sells type?
Yeah, exactly. If it bleeds, it leads. That violence sells. It was really interesting. I lived in the United States during the 1990s when there were all sorts of scares about violence, crime breaking out all over the place, and lots of anti-crime legislation, tough on crime legislation. The irony was that it took a long time for people to figure out that this happened at precisely the same moment that the real story was the drop in crime. Not that crime was increasing, but rather it was dropping. Now, just because violence is dropping doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to stay that way. There's all sorts of reasons why there's less violence than there used to be. So we can't just sort of rest on past achievements.
Right.
But I think it's important to have a discussion based on the evidence of what's actually happened.
Yeah, like some raw data. Let's focus on that as opposed to the headlines. That's probably good advice for any major network that's out there. David, the U.S. spends $600 billion, roughly, I think it's $596 billion per annum on their defense budget. China is second place, distant second place at $215 billion, and yet we constantly hear from American politicians that they need more money for defense spending. Why? How is this $600 billion budget not adequate? I don't understand.
Well, I'm not going to justify number one or number two or number X or number Y. What I want to say is that we have to look at the geopolitical conditions of both countries. The United States has coasts on the Atlantic and on the Pacific. It is a major global trader, possibly the major global trader, certainly the major maritime power. And the United States has taken over the role in the last half of the 20th century and in the 21st century of being basically the guarantor of freedom of the seas, as the Royal Navy was through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
Okay.
Now, they don't do that out of the goodness in their hearts. They're not doing it to be, the good guy of the world. They're doing it to protect international maritime commerce. And well over 94% of the world's commerce moves by sea. And the sea is inherently an anarchic place. Mm-hmm. So if you have the U.S. Navy, which is spread out over the Atlantic, over the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, in the South China Sea, so on and so forth, American military expenditures are going to be very, very high in order to sustain that kind of naval presence. The Chinese don't need that kind of naval presence and don't sustain that kind of naval presence. They're focused almost entirely on the South China Sea and the East China Sea. To a certain degree, within the last 10 years, they've been poking across the southern parts of Asia and sticking their noses into the Indian Ocean, but for that very reason, the Indians have been building a navy of their own. And so the Indian Navy is growing as well. So what you've got is one major maritime global power, which is in a sense trying to assert sort of a hegemony, especially over the major choke points of the world's oceans, and doing it primarily to protect its own commerce and that of its allies. And then you've got a rising challenge of China looking at the South China Sea especially, somewhat the way the Americans looked at the Caribbean in the 19th century, i.e. this is our sea and we'll dominate it. Mm-hmm. So they can have a smaller navy, and the United States has to have a much larger navy in order to balance each other out. It's virtually the same kind of situation as we had before the First World War, where the Germans were building a navy. The British Navy was 4 times the size of the German Navy, but the British felt very threatened by the building of the German Navy because the German Navy was not meant to be a global navy, and the Royal Navy was.
It's fascinating. It makes a lot of sense. I want to talk a little bit about corruption quickly. It's believed that the arms dealing around the world makes up for 40% of corruption in world trade. 40% is a staggering number. Is there a country or a region that is a bigger offender than another?
I'm not sure. I think it's by its nature a business that is difficult to monitor and to make accountable. And I think one of the reasons for that has to do with the fact that if you look at which are the actors that can actually sign treaties to, let's say, share information, okay, those are states.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They belong to the United Nations. There's all sorts of official channels, or rule of law, and so on and so forth, to make states accountable. But it turns out that the actors who use weapons are not just states. There's also all sorts of non-state groups that use
militias,
weapons.
terrorist groups.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, armed groups of various sorts, including criminal gangs of varying degrees of legality and institutionalization. So some have some kind of recognition, others are purely illegal or terrorist groups and so on. Yeah. And so there are some initiatives that I think is important to underscore that states have taken to actually make the arms trade more accountable. Recently, over the last few years, a number of countries have signed what's called the Arms Trade Treaty, which is an agreement to share information and to engage in essentially just a much
bit more transparency, I would
tougher
hope.
Kind of transparency, accountability, and information sharing.
Okay.
And so all of that's fantastic, yet it's only states that can sign that kind of treaty, that can sign on. Rebel groups, armed groups, by definition, can't. So there's a lot of gray areas and dark spaces where the arms dealing can go that are just by structure very difficult to monitor.
Interesting.
So corruption breeds in exactly those sorts of spaces.
Of course. Folks, we're going to take a quick break, jump to commercials. Stay with us. We'll be right back.